Let me start by noting that analysts have strong views about how to characterize these disputes. Some call them frozen, others prefer protracted, and still others use other terms. Perhaps our witnesses today will elaborate on the differences among these terms and why the distinctions are important. What is clear, however, is that they are unresolved. Despite the efforts of the OSCE Minsk Group and the occasional exuberant claims of imminent success, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict looks little different than 15 years ago. Things are different in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, of course, where matters languished unchanged for many years until the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. Today, Moscow would claim that these conflicts are basically over because these two territories have become independent. But that is a decidedly minority view. Apart from Russia, only Nicaragua, Venezuela, and the tiny island statelets of Vanuatu and Nauru have recognized their independence. The rest of the international community has refused to do so. This includes all the members of the CIS, which have so far resisted Moscow's threats and blandishments. Obviously, they understand that if Russia, which has never implemented the ceasefire plan and instead established military bases in these territories, can truncate Georgia, it can do the same to them. As for the US government, Washington echoes Tbilisi's view that Russia is occupying Georgian territory, so from that perspective, nothing has been resolved at all. These conflicts, at least in their most recent incarnation, erupted in the late 1980s when the Soviet Union was breaking up and various minority groups decided they did not want to be part of the Union Republic they had been part of during the Soviet period. This created contradictions between two Helsinki principles, territorial integrity and self-determination. To this day, after 2 decades of mediation, the parties refer to these two principles as their guiding lights and justification. Neither the negotiators nor the international community have been able to bridge the gap. Meanwhile, the conflicts have threatened the stability and security of the entire region. The war of 2008 showed how quickly supposedly frozen conflicts can heat up, adding to the already huge number of refugees produced in the early 1990s. At the same time, all the countries and peoples of the Caucasus would benefit from economic integration and using natural and human resources for purposes of development. Instead, significant assets are being devoted to military purposes. Maybe we shouldn't even expect a settlement, given how long disputes in other regions of the world have lasted. But we are bound to explore if there is a way out of what appears to be a dead end, especially if there's reason to worry about the possible resumption of military hostilities. Are there approaches that have not been tried? Is it possible that the status quo, however awful, offers advantages to influential parties that outweigh the risks of compromise? In the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there is the inescapable Russian factor. Are there circumstances under which Moscow would ever retract its recognition of their independence? In other words, would Russia ever permit a deal, even if Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia could agree on one? Could other regional dynamics, short as escalating instability in the North Caucasus, affect the situation in South Ossetia and Abkhazia? And what could we say about the efforts of the OSCE and the international community to broker a resolution? These are difficult questions, so we thought hard about who best could address them. We have not invited spokesmen for any government to testify today, including the US government. Nobody would be willing to discuss the details of sensitive negotiations in any case, and besides, after many years of talks, everyone is very well familiar with the public positions of the parties. So we decided instead to hear the views of independent analysts, and thankfully we've been able to assemble a truly expert group of witnesses. Their impressive bios can be found on the Helsinki Commission website, so we're not going to read them out in full. Let me just say that Fiona, Tom, and Wayne are not just highly regarded specialists who've been working these issues for many years. They are also old and good friends, so it's a special treat to have them here today.
Thank you, Mr. Oakes. We are going to hear from our panelists. Just briefly, Dr. Fiona Hill will be our first panelist, the Director of the Center for the United States and Europe.
Thank you very much, Representative Burgess, and I'm delighted to be here today, and it's good to see that in spite of the very inclement weather outside, that lots of people have managed to make it for this hearing. I want to begin my remarks by addressing directly the questions that the Helsinki Commission posed to us for the briefing. The questions, of course, were already distributed to all of you in the announcement. And Michael Oakes has already begun to frame the first part of those questions about where the conflicts stand today. And he posed the question about the differences in terms, frozen, protracted, still unresolved. And I think, I can certainly speak on behalf of my other two colleagues here that we cannot call these conflicts frozen, and indeed Michael said that himself. Protracted, most certainly, and yes, still unresolved. But these are very dynamic conflicts, as all of you in the room know, and the situation on the ground, including in Nagorno-Karabakh, which Michael actually posed has much changed in the last 15 years. In fact, yes, there's been some significant changes in all of these conflicts in their on-the-ground configuration. And it's not just been the outbreak of war in Georgia in 2008 that was the only event here, though perhaps this has been the most notable event. What we saw with the war in Georgia, of course, is that the configuration of contested boundaries changed as a result of that war. And we also got some new dimensions to that specific complex of conflicts with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. We have a controversial ceasefire document that has become itself a focal point of contestation. And the recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia by the handful of rather small states, as well as Russia, that Michael referred to, has brought a whole new dimension to this conflict. And we've also had the introduction of new international actors into the broader conflict zone. Previously, of course, the UN and the OSCE were the principal international players, but now we have the EU in the form of the EU monitoring mission in Georgia. And that also brings, again, a whole array of different dimensions to the conflicts in the region. Now, the only way in which the conflicts can be deemed frozen is that, as Michael also said, that the initial parameters for resolution that we laid out, which was this desire to try to bridge the demands for self-determination by the individual peoples and territories of the conflicted and contested regions, with the imperative of maintaining the territorial integrity of the respective states, has reached an impasse. It's that concept that has become frozen, if anything is frozen at all. And what we've seen over this last almost 20 years now, in terms of thinking about these conflicts, is that increasingly, and especially now, given the obvious developments in 2008, Abkhazia and South Ossetia have rejected the increasingly elaborate attempts to find a proposal for ensuring their autonomy, while at the same time, the two principal states that are involved on the other sides of the conflict, Azerbaijan and Georgia, have found it very difficult to accept proposals that seem, at least have the appearance, of falling short of the full reintegration of the territories back into their state, or of them not seeming to come under their full sovereignty. So this is really what Michael was talking about the frozen aspects of it, and it's really the impasse that we've reached, the inability to find this bridge. Now, the other question that was posed here is the resumption of armed hostilities a serious threat? I think as we saw in 2008, and we've seen continuously since, there is always the risk of miscalculation and of seemingly isolated incidents of violence sparking out of control. Since the war in Georgia, we've seen repeated incidents of violence in Georgia itself and in the territories of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. We've also seen at many times what looks to be the result of deliberate provocation to up the political ante when we've reached critical junctures in negotiations. And that's been, unfortunately, very much the case in Nagorno-Karabakh, where we've seen consistently relatively large numbers of casualties in ceasefire violations and sniper attacks along the line of contact in Nagorno-Karabakh. And also we've seen a great deal of bellicose rhetoric on all sides, especially at the state level in Azerbaijan and also in Armenia, that have further inflamed the situation and have increased the potential for violent incidents to get out of hand. And then, as Michael mentioned, although this isn't the specific topic of our briefing today, but obviously it's an important component, we have the added complication of armed hostilities that are already underway in North Caucasus across the border. Their insurgency and violence are a fact. They're not just something of dispute. And as all of you in this room know, historically the violence in the North Caucasus has led into violence in the South Caucasus. The two areas are intrinsically interlinked in terms of their populations and their shared history within both the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union. And the fact that armed hostilities are ongoing in the North Caucasus really increases the level of tension in the south. And I would say, unfortunately, the situation in the North Caucasus is likely to become more rather than less tense as we look ahead over the next couple of years. We're seeing now turbulent politics in Russia in the wake of the recent Duma elections. We don't know how that is all going to unfold. We have next March's presidential election in Russia, and obviously there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on the various regions as to see how people are going to engage in the election campaign over the next 3 months. And then, of course, we have the impending event of the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014, which has been designated a national priority project by the Russian government and has obviously become quite a focal point in the North Caucasus. Moscow is extremely concerned about the risks to the Olympic project from the ongoing insurgency. Moscow also, to some degree, was very concerned about the implications of Sochi, of its ongoing disputes with Georgia, and we can say that Sochi was a factor in propelling Georgia and Russia toward war in 2008. And we could also, of course, point to many instances where cross-border insurgency, particularly spillover from Chechnya, has resulted in Russia's intervention directly in Georgia's internal affairs. And the Georgian government's quite recent explicit support for North Caucasian groups, including those who are concentrated around in Sochi, the Circassians, and their grievances against Moscow and against the Russian state have certainly caught Moscow's attention and raised the political tension even further. So I would say that unfortunately over the next couple of years we see potentially even more dangerous situation emanating where North and South Caucasus become intertwined. Now, the other question was raised about what factors impede a settlement. And now, as I started to put together my bullets for this, I could have gone on perhaps for pages, and I know that Wayne and Tom would also like something to say, so I've confined myself to, I think it's sort of 7 or 8 bullets here, which is, of course, not at all exhaustive of all of the different factors. Michael already mentioned perhaps the primary factor, the fact that the roots of the conflicts are very long and are intrinsic to the setup of the administrative structures and the nationality policies of the Soviet Union. And as Michael said, the roots of most of the conflicts date back to the 1980s, and in some cases some of the factors for conflict go back to the Tsarist era. So it makes it very difficult to basically disentangle some of the elements of conflict here. But as most of us know, in any case, the independent modern states of Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia were never established in their administrative configuration to be independent. They were intended to be interdependent with each other as well as dependent on Moscow, and that is primarily one of the problems that we see. And the constitution of the Soviet Union, in theory at least, provided for autonomous regions like Abkhazia, South Ossetia and Nagorno-Karabakh to also appeal to Moscow for a change in their status, and as Michael alluded, some of that was already underway by the late 80s and certainly in the 1990s, and that also includes republics in the North Caucasus as well. So we have a very complicated situation to handle here. Also, none of the contested territories, or indeed the states themselves, have really had any independent existence outside of the framework of the Soviet Union or of the Russian Empire, with of course the exception of a very brief period of independence after the collapse of the Russian Empire and just after World War I. The other fact that we need to bear in mind is that conflicts do not exist in a vacuum. And Michael already referred to Transnistria and said that that was not a subject of a discussion today. But in addition to strong parallels with the Transnistrian conflict, obviously, that also involves Moldova, there are distinct parallels between these conflicts in the Caucasus and conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, such as Kosovo, and we could go on in a broader sense there, but also Cyprus, and indeed the Middle East conflict between Israel and the territories of Palestine, the Palestinian territories. And a lack of settlement in each of these other cases that I've listed here provides, in fact, a rather negative example, unfortunately, for the protracted conflicts in the South Caucasus. If there had been, say, a major breakthrough in Cyprus or elsewhere, we might have something positive to point to that might provide a different frame of reference. What we've seen instead, unfortunately, is that the attempts to resolve the conflict in Kosovo and the disputes between Kosovo and Serbia provided, in fact, yet another negative factor in the resolution of the South Caucasus conflicts and can be said to also impede a settlement. The United States government explicitly denied, of course, the existence of any parallels between Kosovo and the South Caucasus and the fact that this could possibly set a precedent for Caucasus resolution. But in fact, what the international recognition of Kosovo did, because it was treated entirely separately from this, was greatly complicated the situation between Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And Tom Duval very eloquently about this at various points just after that decision. The parallels and precedent were quite obvious, certainly to people on the ground, and they were explicitly used, of course, by the Russian government in its engagement of all the three parties to the Georgian complex of conflicts, and also explicitly used by the Russian government in their direct involvement in the conflicts and in the war. Kosovo was used as a point of reference, in fact, for Russia's recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia's independence. And Abkhazia and South Ossetia now assert that on the basis of the Kosovo precedent and Russia's recognition of their independence, even if that hasn't been picked up on an international level, that they should no longer be expected to negotiate their relationship with Georgia on the old terms. And clearly Georgia, because nobody else has recognised this, and in fact because of the long nature and details of the conflict, naturally refuses to engage with the territories on these terms, and in any way that might suggest some kind of implicit acknowledgement of any change whatsoever in their status. So we've got ourselves into another impasse as a result of what happened in Kosovo. And even the convoluted way that I'm describing it here, you can see that it's become difficult for experts like myself to even talk about this without raising a whole host of additional questions, and we have to prefigure everything with 7 or 8 bullet points of caveats before we even mention the issue. Now, notably, of course, Russia has not made the parallel between Kosovo and Nagorno-Karabakh, nor has it made any attempt to recognise its independence, which underscores how much bilateral political antipathy between Russia and Georgia has framed Moscow's response to the conflict, and to the conflicts in general. Now, another couple of factors just to mention before getting on to the last set of questions about the negotiating format. One very important factor that we see now, and this is where things really have changed in Karabakh and elsewhere over the last 15 to 20 years, is we've got a whole generation of people who have grown up on both sides of each conflict without any experience of interaction with each other. And they obviously have very different attitudes, very different experiences, very different expectations and intentions from the generation before them. And new relationships have developed between populations and those outside the region. So we have a whole different dimension and a whole different outlook now on the conflicts than what we had 20 years ago. Also, local governments, and I mean this both at the level of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and then Azerbaijan, I mean in Georgia, have also had their own problems in establishing and consolidating and keeping hold of their own legitimacy, and the conflicts have become part of this issue. And what we've seen is when there's been a lot of questions about democratic developments, whether there have been contested elections, whether there have been other questions about the legitimacy of local leaders, the governments have often resorted at all different levels to rhetoric about the conflicts to compensate for and deflect away from political failings. South Ossetia, which we may get into in the discussion, is a classic case in point right now after a contested and rather disputed election just in the last month. Now this, of course, has an impact on the negotiating format, this legitimacy issue on the part of local governments. Because the international negotiating mechanisms that were set up in response to the armed conflicts of the 1990s have now become part of the domestic political scene in each case. They've been around, frankly, as long as the governments have been around, as long as the independent states have been around. They've almost evolved along with the conflicts, and they're no longer seen as neutral. And they're often presented as different actors on different sides, by different actors on different sides of the Caucasus as part of the problem. They've become very politicised, not by the fault necessarily of those people involved in the negotiations, but just by the mere fact of existing so long. They're used by regional leaders frequently as an excuse for avoiding compromise. In the case of Karabakh, for example, we frequently hear after failed rounds of negotiations, well, the Minsk group didn't do their job properly. Nobody says, well, I, the leader of this or that entity, couldn't really reach a compromise this time because of X, Y, domestic factors. This wasn't a good juncture. It's very easy to blame the Minsk group for them, rather than air out all of the dirty laundry and all the difficulties of your domestic politics that have prevented you from being able to move forward in any way. One of the other issues that we're currently facing also in the negotiations is the lack of time and resources on the part of the international players. The Minsk group's been around so long that the world has changed, and now we have the inevitable press of other international issues. And the impact of ongoing economic crises on diplomacy. People don't have the same time and effort or the same money to expend on these ventures as they did before. And what we've also seen is the US, Europe and all the other international entities, the UN and OSCE, have all developed their own approaches to conflict. They've all put money into their individual mechanisms, and everyone is now facing the question of what to do with dwindling budgets and dwindling cadres of international diplomats about what can they do. So is it possible, for example, to join forces for a concerted effort to push things forward? That's one of the questions about could we have a new negotiating format. At different points people have suggested this. However, I would say that it's not entirely clear, and Wayne and Tom, I think, will have a lot of opinions on this, as to whether setting something new up would actually solve the conflicts. We actually saw in the last year an intense personal push, and I would actually say quite a sincere personal push by Russian President Dmitry Medvedev on Nagorno-Karabakh. He spent a lot of time and effort in bringing the leaders together and trying to push things forward. He didn't really get anywhere. And it wasn't really the lack of effort on his part or the resources that was the problem, simply that, again, this was not a good juncture for the conflicting parties to reach a resolution. So, and my final point is, what can the United States, what can others do to facilitate a resolution, is perhaps we need to go back to the drawing board about what do we mean by resolution. Because there's not, as I said at the very beginning, and as Michael has made clear, any status quo ante to refer back to or even to go back to, given the nature of the conflicts. The US and everybody else has their own domestic political problems that make it difficult always to make a firm push on issues. We have as many problems in being an honest broker as the regional leaders do in really themselves being able to be honest about finding a path forward. And by always pushing for the bridge, the final resolution, the way of putting everything together, we always set ourselves up for failure. So the question is, can we set ourselves a different set of goals? And Tom and Wayne and others have been engaged in efforts like this, and it'd be good to hear directly from them about some of the things we could do. But one thing where we have seen where there has been a breakthrough is not on the conflict itself, but on creative pollutions, but has been recently on WTO and the negotiations between Georgia and Russia. And maybe this is just something that we can think about for moving forward. In the case of the WTO negotiations between Georgia and Russia, obviously the critical issue of status and the status of South Ossetia and Abkhazia was a critical issue. The Georgians were very worried that any agreement that they reached would somehow have an implication for the conflict. But what we saw instead was very creative mediation on the part of the Swiss. The United States wasn't out in front, we were leading from behind. And the final resolution in this, for this very narrow thing was outsourcing of the customs monitoring to a private entity. So the question is, can private entities, can these kinds of creative solutions play a role where the larger negotiation formats have failed?
Thank you, Mr. Linder. Mr. Waal.
That sounds better. Thank you, Congressman, and thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming. Inevitably, I will go over some of the same ground as Fiona. I think has covered a lot of territory very well, but I'll try and do it in my own way. As Michael told us, we're currently marking the 20th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union, when the three conflicts we're discussing, Abkhazia, South Ossetia and Nagorno-Karabakh, were already breaking out. That they're still unresolved 20 years on shows how intractable and complex they are. It's worth recalling that all three conflicts began before the Soviet Union ended, something which makes it even harder to resolve them. The residents of the three conflict regions have never experienced life in independent Azerbaijan or Georgia, only in their Soviet-era predecessor republics. Generations are growing up ignorant of one another. It's important to stress an obvious point in our title, which we may run over as we move to the content. These are conflicts with conflicting sides and narratives. I do not see a moral bias in them towards one side or the other. In the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the Georgian side basically started the conflict in 1990 in South Ossetia and in Abkhazia in 1992. But both sides did terrible things in those two conflicts, and the vast majority of displaced people from the conflicts are ethnic Georgians. For both sides in those conflicts, the experience has been a huge national trauma. Consider that the Abkhaz lost around 4% of their entire ethnic population at the war of 1992 to 1993, and that around 80% of Georgians living in Abkhazia before the war are still displaced from their homeland. When it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenians emerged the victor on the ground in the 1991-4 conflict, but both sides paid a heavy price. Both sides have a long list of black dates, quote unquote, commemorating what is in effect the attempt of each to destroy the other. The Armenian side recalls the pogroms in Sumgait and Baku, deportation of Armenians from Azerbaijan, the shelling of civilians in Stepanakert, the massacre at Maragha. Azerbaijanis recall the deportations of Azerbaijanis from Armenia, the massacre at Khojali, the expulsion of 500,000 Azerbaijanis from the 7 territories around Karabakh in 1992-4. So there are no angels here, and it would be a mistake for the United States to assert the morality of one side over the other in any of these conflicts. A few words about the situation with Georgia's conflicts after the war of 2008. Recognition as independent states by Russia has obviously dramatically changed the situation for both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. From their point of view, a Russian military presence means protection from Georgia. But it also meant de facto annexation by Russia, which makes many people in Abkhazia in particular resentful. In some ways, you could argue that in fact Abkhazia and South Ossetia were de facto independent before 2008 and are now more dependent, even though they've been recognized by Russia. The trajectories of the two territories are also diverging. South Ossetia is barely viable as a self-governing territory, let alone a state, having a population of barely 30,000 people. Abkhazia is more viable with a population of more than 200,000, has working institutions and media, but it obviously lacks legitimacy, if only, as also in South Ossetia, because of the issue of its missing Georgian population. That means that the policy of non-recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is definitely the right one. But within that framework, I would urge greater pragmatism. The current residents of these territories are not second-class human beings. Their aspirations and insecurities are genuine, if not their sovereignty. They will not go away, and by their power status, they also basically hold hostage the fate of the Georgian IDPs. South Ossetia is both more isolated and more liable in the future to do a deal with Georgia. It was part of Georgia's economic space up until 2004. Simply opening the border would be a catalyst for normalization. Abkhazia is more complex. People there are more aggressive in asserting their independence, but also genuinely seek engagement with the world beyond Russia and Georgia. A deal with them will be a very long-term process. Pragmatic, status-neutral ways of allowing young Abkhaz to travel and study abroad and engage with the outside world would be a win-win arrangement for all. The current Georgian strategy on engagement, despite promising much, has failed to deliver that. A more pragmatic strategy on elections would also be beneficial. In April 2010, the United States congratulated, quote, Mr. Devis Eroglu for his victory in elections held to select the leader of the Turkish Cypriot community, unquote. What is right for one unrecognized entity should be right for others. Recognition of Abkhaz, Ossetian and Karabakh Armenian leaders as local governments is a good step, which will increase engagement and leverage. If Western governments had taken that approach with South Ossetia, they would now be able to exert leverage to voice support for the candidate there who has popular backing, because election was recently stolen, a la Georgieva. When it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, the situation gets harder and harder. There is a small but growing risk of renewed conflict, of which I think Wayne will tell us a lot more. In large part, this is because of a growing problem of perception. Armenians believe they have built a de facto state on the ground in Karabakh. As a new generation is growing up that has never met an Azerbaijani, and there is no going back. The recognitions of Kosovo, Abkhazia and South Ossetia give them hope that their turn may come in the future. Azerbaijan, by contrast, sees that its economy is 6 times bigger than in the 1990s, that it now spends more on its military than Armenia does on its entire government budget, and that Azerbaijan is now an international player who will soon be a member of the UN Security Council in January. All this makes it much harder to forge a peace than a decade ago. There's nothing wrong in principle with the OSCE Minsk process and the mediation of 3 important global actors, France, Russia and the United States. But the Minsk process also lacks the authority it had in the 1990s, when both sides were much weaker. Changing the Minsk group format would be a distraction in my view. It would not change the nature of the problem. Content is more important than form, and the content is defined by the 2 presidents who are the conductors of the process. Currently, they basically prefer the status quo to the risk of changing it. A few basic explanations why this is so. The presidents prefer a closed process that does not involve Armenian or Azerbaijani societies. This means that the two societies are still stuck in a no-compromise mentality, and the presidents have no peace constituency supporting them if they want to do a deal. Important players with a stake in the outcome of negotiations, for example the Karabakh Armenians and their elected authorities, and also Azerbaijani IDPs, do not have a proper voice in the process. The discourse on the conflict is dominated by two aggressive, competing Armenian and Azerbaijani narratives. A third narrative of peace, compromise, and peaceful coexistence is not being expressed or heard, either locally or internationally. The conflict is a second-order priority for the international community, which is reluctant to invest major resources in it without an obvious hope of a good result. Compare the situation to the crisis in the Balkans in the 1990s, when both the EU and the US could not ignore it. Finally, there is a lack of clarity as to who will provide peacekeeping and post-conflict reconstruction when peace is finally agreed. This makes the parties even more cautious. So a final recommendation for the Karabakh peace process, that paradoxically the Minsk Group co-chair countries should offer both less and more. By less I mean that the mediators must stress that they alone cannot solve the conflict, and it is fundamentally up to the parties on the ground. This means that they should encourage Armenians and Azerbaijanis to take greater ownership of their own conflict and the search for a mutually acceptable deal through bilateral negotiations. The mediators can emphasize that they are available for advice and support and will still keep up their ceasefire monitoring function, but they will also take a step back and give more responsibility to the parties in crafting the actual nature of the deal. By more, I mean that simultaneously the mediators, led by the US, but supported by other international bodies such as the EU, UN and World Bank, should pledge more by more publicly asserting that they will provide the necessary resources in terms of peacekeeping, policing and reconstruction to underpin an eventual peace settlement. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll hear from Mr. Gary.
Congressman, thank you very much for taking some of your very busy day to focus your attention on these issues. As a former staff member of the Helsinki Commission, let me also say it's always a pleasure to return to this venue. I would like to use this opportunity to sound a genuine note of alarm about the potential for renewed war over Karabakh. Whoever came up with the phrase frozen conflicts has much to answer. These conflicts are anything but stable. They are volatile and they are dangerous. In the months leading up to the August 2008 war, many observers, myself included, believed that the Georgian president would resort to military means in either Abkhazia or South Ossetia, and the Russian government would respond with overwhelming and disproportionate force. Yet when the war came, our own government and many others purported to be surprised by it. I would hope that our government and others would be very conscious of the increasing momentum toward conflict in another part of the Caucasus, Karabakh. In my former official capacities, starting in 1991 with the State Department, the Pentagon, and here at the Helsinki Commission, I had what I might call vestigial involvement with the Karabakh issue. Since leaving the government, I've certainly maintained an interest in it. 2 years ago, I published a somewhat longish article in the British Open Democracy Net vehicle discussing the security and military aspects of Karabakh, based in part on what I had learned in my Pentagon years. In recent months, however, I have noted in conversations both with private observers here in Washington and with some government officials an increased concern that the momentum toward armed conflict is accelerating and the danger of a new war is becoming more real. With this in mind, I used the opportunity of a trip last month to Armenia for an international conference to make a trip to Nagorno-Karabakh to see the local situation for myself. I introduced two important provisos. First, this trip had no official status whatsoever, did not in any way represent a gesture by any official entity of the United States. Second, the trip was in no way partisan. I've made it clear to the Azerbaijani embassy that I would be delighted to make a parallel visit to their side of the line of contact. that I was using the opportunity of my visit to Armenia to visit Karabakh simply because I felt I should no longer be in a position of writing and talking about this issue without actually seeing it with my own eyes. The focus of my visit to Karabakh, even though I did meet with senior political figures and with members of civil society, was on security questions. I spent most of the day with the Karabakh army and was allowed to see a great deal. No state secrets, but to see a great deal. I was actually in the very front trench on the Endowment front, less than 200 meters from the Azerbaijani front trench. I saw the Agdam region, which is, I can tell you, a battlefield in the waiting, with multiple layers of echelon defenses in depth, minefields, anti-tank barriers, prepared artillery positions, and on and on and on. Most of these things that I saw, I was already familiar with from satellite photography. It is quite a different experience to visit a former and potential future battlefield at the ground level and to meet some of the young men who might become casualties in a renewed war. My concern about the increased probability of war over Karabakh has 5 components. First, that the no war, no peace situation since 1994 has not evolved in anything resembling peace. The estrangement between the two communities has deepened. The sense of dehumanization of the other side has, I think, become extremely dangerous. And what we see now is not a quasi-peace, it is a quasi-war. Second, the failure of the mediation efforts by the Minsk group have led to a great deal of frustration on both sides. More understandably, of course, on the Azerbaijani side. Now, being acquainted with diplomacy myself and with most of the American participants in the Minsk group, I understand the fundamental problem that mediators do not negotiate. Mediators mediate. Only parties negotiate. And the parties to this conflict have used the mediation process largely to avoid their responsibilities to negotiate and to avoid their responsibilities to educate and inform their own populations about the compromises that would be necessary to achieve peace. Nonetheless, the expectation among populations on both sides that international mediation by 3 great powers could or should result in peace has obviously led to a very great deal of frustration on both sides and a temptation to resort to arms as an alternative. Third, there is a very substantial arms race underway, fueled on the Azerbaijani side by its oil and gas revenues, fueled on the Armenian side by transfers from the Russian Federation. This arms race is continuing and is reaching, in my view, very, very worrisome proportions. Which leads to the 4th point, which is the continuing level of ceasefire violations, which have become so routine that they are not even reported in the West anymore. And yet I can tell you that they have become a normal part of the line of contact on both sides and have led to many casualties, many of them civilians. Ceasefire violations are something which can get out of hand in a big hurry if not better controlled. The lack of any kind of confidence building measures, the most minimal means of communication across the line of control are lacking. Things that we regarded as fundamental in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in places like Germany do not exist here at all. And finally, to me, the most worrisome thing of all is the increasing level of expectations which I observe on both sides that a war is inevitable and may even be desirable. A view that the war is coming and a view increasingly to be heard on both sides that the war would, whatever its cost, resolve the Karabakh issue on terms desirable to that side. Now clearly, both sides cannot be correct in this evaluation, but both can be wrong. I believe both are wrong. I believe they are wrong if for no other reason than the probable nature of a renewed war. A renewed war would not look anything like the 1991-94 conflict. That war was a series of interlocking, basically infantry battles with some degree of armored and artillery support. Since that time, Nagorno-Karabakh has become a fortress, a combination of its natural topography, which is often very formidable, but also very thoroughly prepared, echeloned defenses in depth. Therefore, a battle over Karabakh again would be a siege. Throughout human history, sieges have been notorious for brutality, bloodshed, and their cost to civilian populations. A siege battle has two components, usually sequential: bombardment and assault or engagement. The two parties have been preparing extensively for a major bombardment war, buying or acquiring by other means large inventories of multi-launch rocket systems and long-range artillery and very extensive munitions. It is quite clear to me that a bombardment war between the two sides would very, very quickly involve major civilian casualties. Indeed, I was told quite clearly by a counterpart in Yerevan that the targeting on their side would be, as he put it, counter value, which is to say targeting civilian installations, civilian infrastructure. And I have no doubt that would be the case on both sides. I think it unlikely that such a brutal bombardment war would remain static for long. Both sides have very significant mobile operational capabilities. I think the Armenian side should not underestimate the extent of improvement in the Azerbaijani order of battle and in its operational capabilities. Likewise, the Azerbaijanis should not underestimate the capabilities of their opponents. Just to give one example, the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, as it proclaims itself to be, has, I believe, the highest ratio of mobile armored equipment per capita of any entity on the face of the earth. With a population of under 150,000, Karabakh maintains, depending on whose sources you believe, something like 300 main battle tanks and comparable levels of armored personnel systems, mobile artillery, and so forth. A mobile war battle could start from either side or both sides and become very, very bloody very, very quickly. Now, the problem is not just Armenians and Azerbaijanis killing each other. The problem is that both sides have regional great power sponsors. Russia has a treaty-based alliance with Armenia. This does not cover Karabakh, but in the scenario I have just sketched, I think that would quickly become a distinction without a difference. Turkey does not have a legal obligation to Azerbaijan, but the political impetus in the Turkish Republic to support their cousins in Azerbaijan in such a conflict would become very, very strong, I believe, indeed. I am certainly not predicting that Turkey and Russia would come to blows over Karabakh. But a proxy war fed and supported by regional great powers can assume proportions much greater than those that would be calculated by the participants themselves. The consequences of this are quite literally unpredictable. I am not predicting that war is inevitable, much less that it is imminent. What I am saying that the momentum toward renewed conflict over Karabakh, which has been present for several years, is continuing and even accelerating. It should be the subject for genuine concern. In 2008, the United States government attempted diplomatic jawboning to try to prevent a conflict between Russia and Georgia. That policy failed. My view is that the focus, not just of American policy, but of the policies of other interested powers, should focus on real settlement, negotiation, not mediation, and the fact that great powers have responsibilities to themselves and to each other to prevent client states from engaging in behavior which is deleterious to the interests of the region and the world as a whole. In a previous article, I speculated that Karabakh could actually be a productive venue for traditional great power collusion between Russia and the United States. Today, I would add Turkey to that equation. But regardless of the methods undertaken, I would urge that in Washington, Paris, Brussels, Ankara, Moscow, even Tehran, complacency should be avoided. This is a very dangerous situation, and it requires serious attention. Thank you, sir.
And thank you, Mr. Murray. Certainly very compelling testimony on your first-person visit to the Karabakh. I'll just have to say, as a first-term congressman here in 2004, after a shooting at Beslan, I accompanied another congressman from Colorado on a trip over there because we wanted to offer just support to the people who were going through that. And I was absolutely unprepared for the level of interference. As a member of Congress, you can't just slip in and slip out of places unknown. But the actual official opposition to us even being around was something for which I was unprepared. So certainly kudos to you for getting in and giving us that first-hand on-the-ground report, because that's pretty compelling testimony that you've provided for us. You know, in 2008, in this country, we were kind of riveted on a presidential election this summer. The stock market hadn't yet melted down. So what happened between Georgia and Russia, as a member of Congress, I could say that was a surprise to me. I guess I didn't appreciate the level of what you described as job bullying that was going on between the administration and the Russians at that point. But what is the status of the discussions that are occurring presently? You described a fairly stark scenario of conflict that may be inevitable and by some parties even desired. What is going on right now between the U.S. and Russian governments to prevent that from happening?
Congressman, as a non-official, I can't give you any authoritative answer to that. The easy answer would be to say that question should be addressed to the State Department and the White House. I will, however, say that I have spoken with some quite senior people in U.S. government since I returned from this trip and found that their concern parallels my own. I am not saying that I think that there is ignorance or acquiescence to a continuation of the status quo in the U.S. government. I do feel, however, and in this I must take a different view than my colleague Tom Duvall, that the current mechanisms of mediation and negotiation are inadequate. That I think that a fundamentally different approach to problem resolution on Karabakh is called for. My own view is that this should involve a negotiation which would lead to final resolution of status and rectification of international frontiers. I'm not saying it would be easy. As a former diplomat, I understand that. I do think, however, that the rather incremental step-by-step approach that has been pursued at great effort and often with the involvement of very senior political levels in the three governments of the Minsk Group co-chairs has proven unproductive till now, and therefore I think one should seriously consider a different approach.
Tom, in fairness, I need to give you a chance to respond.
Yes, I would half agree with Wayne there. In fact, I think if you listen carefully to my testimony, what I'm saying is that what the Karabakh peace process doesn't need is a redesign with another international organisation such as the UN being brought in, or a Norwegian mediator and so on. What it does need is reinvigoration, and my last two recommendations mean, one, the mediators taking a step back and facilitating more genuine negotiations between the parties, as indeed Wayne has just said, and also that to use a rather Bolshevik word, that the Minsk Group should be at the vanguard of a much bigger process with other international organizations EU, UN, World Bank, many others, offering their resources to support the process. It's a much too narrow process at the moment. I think we can all agree on that.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for the testimony. I unfortunately have a phone call with a hard time that I have to make, so I'm going to turn the questioning over to Mr. Oakes and Ms. Packer for follow-up. Thank you.
Before we proceed, I'd like to ask if, well, Tom has just responded to Wayne's remarks. I wonder if anyone else on the panel has something to say about your colleagues' statements. Are there any statements you'd like to make before we begin formal questions and answers?
Just one thing. While I think Wayne spoke very eloquently, and I would not in any way downplay the long-term trend that he's analysed about a drift towards conflict. I would just add one nuance, which was that having been on the Azerbaijani side in Baku in the summer, very much the rhetoric there is that the military build-up is not about going to war. It is about the metaphor they use. I'm not ascribing anything to this. I'm just relaying what I heard in Azerbaijan. The metaphor they use is Reagan and the Soviet Union. It's a military build-up as a way of economically weakening the Armenian side in order to extract more concessions out of them. I noticed that there was a distinct lack of war rhetoric in Azerbaijan in the summer. Now that could change, and one could argue that there's a kind of structural problem there which is inherently dangerous, and I would agree with that. However, I would say that, and I think Wayne would probably agree with me, we're not talking about imminent war, we're just talking about a long-term trend which is dangerous.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to this, because I think that Tom and Wayne have shown that they're not actually in really extreme disagreement here, but that there's an elements of things that they're both saying that we should pay attention to. I think our biggest problem is institutionalising the reinvigoration of the process of trying to facilitate new negotiations, because what we've seen, and both of you have referred to this, has been rather the personalisation of some of these efforts, because it's been very much focused on both the presidents, in the case of Karabakh, of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and other leaders, but it's also required, as you both have said, the intercession of senior figures associated with the Minsk Group players. So we saw President Medvedev, who took a major role in the course of this year. We've seen intercession by Secretary Clinton. We've seen, in other words, larger figures from all the Minsk Group countries stepping up. And the problem is when you demand this kind of attention from the senior figures, you run into the problem of, as Wayne pointed out, second-order considerations here. That Nagorno-Karabakh, unless it looks like the imminent breakout of a war tomorrow, doesn't get the attention then that it deserves. And I think what Tom was speaking out in favour of there was finding a way of institutionalising this, and that's the real dilemma that we have. And we're going to be facing, in Minsk Group countries, all three of them, Russia, France, and the United States, elections in 2012. So we're going to have a major problem here, and we need to then think how we're going to get ourselves through the French, the Russian, and the US elections. And that is going to be a real challenge for us, because although we don't see Nagorno-Karabakh rising up to a first-order election issue, the fact of elections and domestic politics and all of the baggage that will be brought out in the election campaigns will have an unfortunate effect, no doubt, on Karabakh.
I would note that arms races have a tendency of creating their own logic. During his most recent visit to Washington, I suggested to Azerbaijani Foreign Minister Mamedyarov that while an arms buildup can contribute to the effectiveness of diplomacy, at some point it becomes counterproductive to diplomacy, because it creates such a perception of threat on the other side that it creates the danger of either preemption from the other side or a felt need on the other side to respond to that arms race proportionally or disproportionately. My own view is that the arms race has probably passed that point, and that further arms buildup on either side, let alone both, do not contribute to stability but erode it. I am also conscious, having been a former professional diplomat, that in any environment in which foreign ministries are in competition with defense ministries, foreign ministries tend to be overwhelmed by the resources and the priorities of military institutions. It is extremely difficult for diplomacy to prevail when you have a momentum of arms buildup. I would note that it certainly has not been for lack of very senior level involvement from the French Republic, from the United States, from the Russian Federation, that these mediation efforts have not failed. I quite agree with Fiona Hill that President Medvedev invested a very great deal of his time in the run-up to the meeting at Kazan. Both the French and American presidents were involved in making phone calls. I can tell you from my own experience how difficult it is to get the President of the United States to make an international phone call. This is not a trivial commitment of time and effort by a government like ours. It is my concern, however, that that these, once having been engaged in and being unproductive, that the frustration with the unproductiveness of the process affects not just the peoples on the respective side of the conflict, but invests the governments of the three mediating parties themselves, especially as they are all going into political election years. I would think it very, very difficult to get the kind of high-level involvement that was present at Kazan anytime in the next 18 months. And a year or two from now, the environment on the ground could become much more difficult.